Hi class, Dr. Jim here. In this video, we're going to look at animal behavior. So we're going to look at why animals do what they do and see how they do these different things. And so we're going to look at behavior as a sense of one, just looking at why animals behave the way they do, some of the rituals that they have. Some of these things they are born with or innate behaviors where they basically learn them right out of the womb type of thing or learn right out of the egg. Some of these things they learn, so we'll talk about learning and how learning affects behavior. And then we'll focus in on some of the courtship behaviors that animals have. And this is a real important thing. So, obviously, mating is a big issue in biology. And so, if animals want to pass their genes on and off to the next generation, they have to learn how to courtship and then find the right mate. So, we're going to look at that and we'll look at some mating behaviors that are out there. We'll look at some of the displays and then talk about some of the animal relationships and those types of things. And then this ultimately leads us to again successful raising of offspring and going on from there. So we'll look at some of that as well as how that plays, and then finally at the very end kind of talk a little bit about genetics and how genetics plays a role in passing those genes on to the next generation. So there's a lot of different little itty bitty things that we're going to be talking about with behavior. It's all very kind of interesting. You can end up taking a whole class on animal behavior and that. We're going to do a little bit in lab looking at animal behavior where we're going to look at pill bug behavior. And then we're also going to look at the beta fish, which the males display aggressive behavior to other males. And so we'll see some examples of that today and see how the mating behavior actually works. So let's talk about animal behavior and see what we're going to be doing today in the lecture itself. So the first thing is what causes animal to display certain behaviors. So we're going to talk about where they get these behaviors from. Are they born with it? Are they something that they learn? Do they go on and do genetics play a role? How do they get these behaviors in the first place? And then we'll see how some of these various behaviors that animals display. We'll talk about again some of the behaviors that we see. Some of them involve courtship, some of them involve survival, some of them involve foraging for food in that. And so we'll look at some of those. We'll talk about learning and how that affects behaviors. So learning plays a big role. So that will change certain behaviors, especially in communities that teach each other. And so we'll show some examples of that as well as display behavior in that. And then we'll look at certain behaviors necessary for survival. So again, courtship behaviors, reproduction, and then also looking at how that plays a role with relationships that animals have with one another. And then finally, what or how does genetics play a role in behavior? So again, a lot of it has to do with displays showing that you have really good genes saying I'm the perfect mate for you. And so that's what we're going to be looking at today is again how animals behave in certain ways to display these things to say, hey, look, I have good genes. And then we'll also look at the role of this interesting aspect called altruism, which is where in order to pass genes on. So this is where one member of the family may save or help other members so that they can be reproductively uh, responsible or type of thing so they can have more offspring and that to pass the genes on to another generation. And so we'll look at that, and that's called Hamilton's rule. So we'll look at that today as well. So lots of different things, again, all displaying around animal behavior. It's a very important, interesting topic. And really, we see this all the way from the very low invertebrates all the way up to humans, obviously, and looking at the various types of behaviors that are out there. So let's take a look and see what the behaviors are actually showing and displaying today in this lecture. So what is a behavior? So the how and why of animal activity. So behavior is an action that's carried out by muscles under the control of the nervous system. Typically, these are things that are voluntary, that are something that sometimes the animal just does because it's kind of ingrained in their DNA. And so we'll look at that as well. Now, behavior is essential for acquiring food, finding mates, and homeostasis. Obviously, we see the grizzlies, what they're doing is trying to get the fish. So obviously to eat, they have to get into the water, almost on the edge of the waterfall, and grab the trout that is swimming, typically swimming to go spawn in that. And so they see all these different behaviors that you see there. Now, behavior is subject to natural selection and influence on evolution in animal anatomy, which also play a role. And so we'll look at this as display characteristics that animals have to say, hey, I'm good to mate with me, or some of the other things that they may have that allow them to survive better in the wild. So we'll look at that as well. Okay, so the first two things I have are just some courtship mating behaviors that you see. Again, these are typically behaviors that are innate, that they're born with. And so the males will display these behaviors to say, hey, I'm a good mate. And then the female will say, yes, you're doing the right behavior. And then they mate together and then they have offspring. And so this one is the Albatross courtship. So you can watch this video real quick and see how that one mates and behaves. And then we'll show you the giraffe courtship. And again, a lot of times it has to do with their necks and the intertwining in that, but you can see this video here and see how giraffes do it. So not only birds, but also in mammals display courtship behavior. And we'll talk more about these types of behaviors later on in the lecture itself. Now, discrete sensory inputs stimulate both simple and complex behaviors. And so one of these big animal behaviorists, Nico Tinbergen, identified 4 questions that should be asked about animal behavior. The first is the how, and then the second 2 are the why. And so the first 2 questions look at the how a behavior occurs or is modified. And so is there a stimulus that elicits a behavior, and what psychological mechanisms mediate the response? And so that's the first thing. So it may be something where a grooming behavior, or something, a warning behavior to protect, or something else. That may be the stimulus. So there may be something coming in, or again, with the grooming behavior, you may have, the sense that you're dirty or something, and then you use the other animal to do that response. And then we look at how does the animal experience during growth and development influence these responses. And so this plays a big thing with learning. And so we'll talk more about learning here in a little while, and how learning affects behaviors as well. So that could be something, again, as the animal ages and learns and sees things out in the wild, they may use different behaviors to protect themselves so that they survive better and longer in the wild. Now, the last 2 ask the why. And again, I said the how and why. And so why a behavior occurs in the context of natural selection. So how does the behavior aid in survival and reproduction? And so one of the things we can look at is display or color or other things, saying, hey, I've got good genes, and then display to make sure that the behavior is right. And then what is the behavior's evolutionary history? So is it something that was just learned, or was it something that's been there for a long time, and that it's an innate behavior that is done from generation to generation to generation? And so that's another thing there. Now, the study of all these different types of behaviors is called behavioral ecology, and it's looking at the ecological and evolutionary basis of animal behavior. And like I said, you can take classes on animal behavior by looking at animals, and we're just going to touch the surface today. In the lab, we're going to do a little bit of animal behavior, but you could even just take some time, if you have a dog or cat at home, and spend about 10 minutes just watching their behavior. Look at what they do. Are they grooming themselves? Are they bathing themselves? Are they sleeping? Do they eat? Do they get up? Do they move around? What toys do they play with? And all these different things. And if you just kind of study them for a little while and kind of just say, okay, I'm going to view for 10 minutes, and then maybe do another experiment with when they feed or other things like that, you can actually learn a lot about your dog or cat by just watching them and looking at some of the behaviors that they display. Like, how does the cat know to go to the litter box, or how does an animal know to bathe themselves and that stuff? Those are all different types of behaviors that either are learned or something that they have kind of ingrained in their brain, that they just know that they're supposed to do this over time. So we'll look at some of that as well. Now, a fixed action pattern is a sequence of unlearned innate behaviors that is unchangeable. So this is something that is done over and over again, that no matter how many times the animal does it, they keep doing it over and over again. And it's something that they don't have to learn. They just kind of just know. It's kind of ingrained in their DNA and their behavior. Once initiated, it's usually carried on to completion, and then the fixed action pattern is triggered by an external cue known as a sign stimulus. So the example I have down here is, let's say an egg has rolled out of the nest. Well, the goose will get up and, as a fixed action pattern, go over, tap the egg, and then roll it back through her legs and back into the nest. And so if another egg does that, she'll show the same display over and over. And so if you trick the goose and put a rock in there and did the same thing and had a rock roll out, she would do the same behavior with the rock as she would with her egg, thinking that it's one of her eggs, and protecting that and doing that. So, and there have been studies that have shown the goose's behavior, that you could put a fake egg into there, a plastic egg, put it into that nest, roll out, and she would do the same behaviors. That she just does this over and over again to protect the eggs when she's laying on the nest. And so that is a fixed action pattern. Now, another one that Tinenbergen observed was these male stickleback fish responding to a passing red truck. So these fish would be in an aquarium and they saw a red truck go by. They would display this active behavior or aggressive behavior towards that stimulus. And so they would see the behavior due to the red underside of an intruder. And so when presented with unrealistic models, the attack behavior was displayed as long as some red was present. And so they just see the red. Now we're going to do something like this in the class when we look at the beta fish. The beta fish respond to the males. And so you'll see males are aggressive to other males. And so it's the fins, it's the color, a lot of times, and other things. And so they will respond as an aggressive behavior. And so we'll see some of these. And this is something that they don't learn it, they just have it ingrained in their innate ability to attack and respond. So we'll look at this actually in the lab, and that will be a fixed action pattern. Okay, now there's also other things like migration, where again environmental cues trigger movement in particular direction. Particular migration is a regular long distance change in location, and then animals orient themselves either using their circadian clock or position of the stars, or even the Earth's electric or magnetic field. So using the North and South Pole to kind of guide them to where they need to go. And so we see this all the time with birds, is that they'll migrate to the north in the springtime, and then they'll return back to the south in the wintertime. And so we see these different patterns. And again, other organisms do this as well. Other animals do this, including insects. We see butterflies that migrate over long distances. We see other organisms that will migrate from one distance to another, and they seem to know where to go. And it's based on either their rhythms, and again, the rhythm tells them, the circadian rhythm tells them when it's time to migrate. So again, the days get shorter, they migrate to the south. When the days get longer, they migrate to the north. Position of the stars to help kind of align them to make sure that they're going. And then, like I said, the magnetic field, looking at which direction, where to go from one direction to the other, can be also a big way for these guys to figure out where to go in the long run. Now, other behavioral rhythms can be daily activity that can be affected by the circadian rhythm. Again, migration, reproduction are linked to changing seasons. And so we talked about that in reproduction with the estrus cycle. A lot of times, estrus cycle is based on the time of year. And so we see that right now in the fall with the deer going to rut. So again, they're looking for mates. And so that's why they're more aggressive at this time, because they're looking for mates to reproduce. And that is all due to, again, the changing seasons. Daylight and darkness are common seasonal cues to, again, determine when migration takes place. And we also know some behaviors like this. So nocturnal animals sleep during the day and are awake at night. And so again, light and dark can affect behaviors and when to forage, when to hunt, and then when to sleep. And so obviously being protected up in a tree and sleeping so that they can be less likely to be attacked at that time, and then forage for dinner at night when again they can be sneaky and attack in the dark and find prey at that time. So these are other things that we see as behavioral rhythms as well. Now, other types of signals in that include the signal that is a behavior that causes change in another animal's behavior. So communication, so we know animals communicate along like humans, but a lot of times they have signals to stimulate, say, hey, I'm hungry, or hey, let's go find food, or as a warning saying there's predators or other things around. And sometimes they use this to even look for mates. And so this is a big deal. So communication, like I said, is the transmission of signals between the animals. And again, whether it's between a pack or maybe individuals or other things, it all has something to do with, again, either survival or mating in these cases. Now, some animals communicate using visual, chemical, tactile, and auditory signals. One of the types of things that are out there is the courtship of fruit flies. And so in this, they have a process known as orientation, tapping, wing vibration, licking, and then the attempted copulation, so that then they can mate and and move on. And so again, this is one of the things that we'll look at here. So in this case with the fruit fly, the first thing that happens is the male identifies a female of the same species and orients towards her. So this is a chemical communication. So the male is attracted by her pheromones, and we'll talk more about pheromones here in a minute. So he smells the female chemicals in the air and is attracted to her. Then he lands in front of her on an angle, and he orients his body towards her to say, here, I'm a male, I'm ready to mate, are you? And so he'll go through this pattern of orienting and saying, hey, I'm here, do you want to mate? And so the difference between males and females have more of a pointed end, and again, you can kind of see the striping where males have more of a blunt end, and again, darker rear or abdomen than the female. And so again, you look at this, and again, the male will approach the female and say, hey, I'm ready to mate. The second step then he'll do is then get behind her and then tap her on the hind leg. And so you can see that he'll use one of his forelegs to tap her on the hind leg and tap her on the belly or the abdomen to say, hey, are you ready to mate? And so this is another mating behavior that takes place. And then finally, he'll produce a song for her, the singing with his beating wings. And this allows to say, yes, I'm of the same species. I am ready to mate. Everything is good. I've got good genes and everything else. And so they communicate. If all these steps are successful, the female will allow the male to copulate. So then she'll get into position, and then he will be allowed to get into position and mate with her and have offspring. And so that's what will happen there. And now in fruit flies, they have internal fertilization. So he will then get in position on top of her. He'll use his abdomen to inseminate her, and then the sperm will find the eggs, and then they'll have fertilization and then make the offspring. And so that's what will happen in the next steps after this mating behavior. Now, other types of communication look at language. And so bees also have a language to tell where their food is and where the distance and direction of the food source. And this is due to what they call the waggle dance. And so the bee will kind of move in a different pattern to say where the food is. So again, first the bee will say, hey, there's food very close. And so he'll do the round dance, and then he'll wiggle his abdomen and say where the location is, and so pointing to the different locations where they are. And again, the orientation, that's where he's doing the wiggle, will also tell him exactly where to go and find this food. So you can see here the A would be straight ahead in this place, so it would be over here relative to the sun. Then the second location would be behind, so again, because he flips around. And then the third location would be 30 degrees from that first location, against towards the sun. And so again, they use the sun in this case as a way of detecting or determining where to go for the food. And so looking at the different distances of food. So again, they have different types of dances depending on how far. So if food is near, they'll do a circle or round dance. In this location, do the wiggle or waggle dance, depending on where this food is. And so again, different dances for different communication. Now, pheromones are an important chemical mediator that allow for animals to communicate through senses. And again, there's a lot of different types of pheromones that get released. A lot of times we can't detect it, or other animals can't detect it, but there's, maybe the olfactory bulbs can, but we don't really smell it. And so this is something that allows us to be attracted to other individuals based on the chemicals they secrete. And so again, these pheromones will hit the olfactory receptor. This will cause gonadotropin release to generate, and then the reproductive neuroendocrine system to kick in. And so this is one way that animals communicate with one another for mating. And so again, the pheromones that are produced, so that again, you allow for communication without really communicating by just the use of smell. And again, they even assume that humans have pheromones as well, and that there's pheromone attractors to males and females that stimulate for attractiveness and other things that allow for females or males to be attracted to one another in these situations. And this is called pheromones. And in fact, they even try and make artificial pheromones to do this attraction and that I don't know how successful they are, but obviously there's claims out there that they're very successful in allowing for attracting the opposite sex. But I can't look at that and say, yeah, whether or not that's true or not, but we do know that there are pheromone chemicals that do attract the opposite sex in other animals as well. Okay, and so another type of thing, so learning establishes specific links between experience and behavior. One of the things that happens is that, again, animals are born with certain behaviors, and this is known as innate behaviors. So we talked about this already, which was the fixed action pattern. Well, there's other behaviors that are also the animals born with. And so one of the things is like building a nest. So that would be an innate behavior. A spider building a spider web and how to build the spider web, they just kind of know. And dolphins actually flipping out of the water, and that's just another innate behavior that isn't learned. It's just something they're born with over, and then it's developmentally fixed in these cases. Now we can see in certain species that we can actually use experience to change behaviors of innate behaviors. And this was done using cross-fostering studies. And so we can look at the contribution of an environment that actually will affect a behavior. And so a cross-fostering study uses young from one species to care for an adults of another species. And so in this situation, this is looking at rats. And so you have two different types of rats. Ones that have high licking behavior and ones that have low licking behavior. And so I think they got the colors mixed up here because they don't mix look here in that. And so I'm not sure why, but maybe it's different with the anxiety and that. I didn't read the whole article, so maybe it is right in not looking at it. So what they did was they show that when the brown mother and the high licking behavior of the postnatal development results in low anxiety for the adults that come from these offspring. Then the mother that has the low licking behavior has high anxiety. So again, with the high in this case. So now if you take a mother who has offspring, but they put it with a mother that has again the high licking behavior, that these and see, I think this is supposed to be white. So what happens is these white mice actually develop low anxiety as opposed to in learning it from the mom to be again a low anxiety. This mother now has offspring, and you put it with a high anxiety mouse. They still, even though they have the high licking behavior, this is where they show that sometimes the experience can be learned, or environmental cues can lead to low anxiety. Where in this situation, again, because these have the high licking behavior already, they're born with it, they also have low anxiety. So they attribute low licking behavior and high anxiety together. And so you can challenge that behavior by putting it with different mothers in that. And so sometimes they can be affected by, again, genetics, and other times or innate behavior. So in this case, even if you put it with a high anxiety mouse, this is not something that's learned, it's innate behavior. But you can change the innate behavior if you have a mother that is low anxiety. So that's something that's kind of interesting, is that you can change it one way, but you can't change it the other. So I think that's kind of an interesting study in general, just looking at some cross-fostering studies. And you can see an example of a number of other cross-fostering studies looking at animals and how it affects behavior and that. And we do this in humans as well. And we can look at, again, toward looking at these different types of things, looking at this. Now, here's another one with the cross-fostering mice and aggression towards the intruder. And again, looking at the difference, and this is looking at those mice. And again, I showed you that with the licking behavior and that, and then showing the comparison with that. And so this just shows you, again, some of the behaviors that they display. Now in humans, I was going to humans and looking at, we do this as well, but we use what is called twin studies. And a lot of times what will happen is we can look at twins that were adopted by different families compared to twins that were raised in the same household. And so that allows us to compare influences genetics and environment on human behavior, because we can look at individuals that have the same genetics, identical twins, because they have the same DNA, but raised in two different households, and we can see how their behavior is. And so that would be something like in this situation where, again, these two twins, maybe they grew up in two different households, they have the same genetics, but Jennifer was raised in a household where they only eat healthy food. And then Karen lives in a household where they only went out to McDonald's and everything else and a lot of unhealthy food. And even though they have the same genetics, Jennifer did not get the obesity because she ate healthy and didn't get the genes triggered by that, where Karen, because she ate poorly, now has obesity because of the genes triggered. And so you can see differences in the twins raised at different households. Now, and then we can compare those to twins that were raised in the same households and see how that also responds. And so this just kind of gives us an idea. And so this is kind of that cross fostering study. We can also look at it, looking at how individual behaviors based on how they're raised in that. And again, there's a lot of studies, human studies, looking at how individual kids are raised and what type of environment to come from. How does that affect their adult behavior? And so there's a lot of studies looking at that as well. And so looking at experience and behavior in those situations as well. Now, we've talked about learning, and learning is the modification of behavior based on specific experiences. And one of the big experiments out there from psychology is Pavlov's dog. And so the idea of that was that the dog was trained or learned that when he heard a bell, that he would get food. And so anytime Pavlov would ring his bell, the dog would start salivating because he would think he was getting fed. And this was a learned behavior. So normal dogs would not respond to a bell and think they're going to get eating. But as soon as you ring that bell a number of times and say, here's food, you can train the animal to respond. And so what happens is whenever they hear the bell, they start salivating and think they're going to get fed. And so I know this with my animals too, is that my cats know exactly when they hear certain cues that they go run to the food bowl. So like I may be opening a bag thinking that I'm opening treats for them, and they think, oh, we're going to get treats, so they run it directly to their bowls. And when I may be opening a bag of chips or a bag of something else, thinking it's their treats. And so it's kind of funny that learning can take place pretty quickly, that animals kind of learn very quickly, and they know. And so I'm sure the same thing happens with your dog or cat at home, where, again, you do certain things, and that triggers a behavior that you may see in them as well. And so that's a learned behavior over time. Now, imprinting is the establishment of a long-lasting behavior response, in particular of an individual object, and this can only take place during a specific time in development, typically right after they're born. And so we see this. And so ducklings follow the mother duck around, and again, this is due to imprinting, because as soon as they're hatched out of the egg, they imprint with the animal that's close. And we see this because other animals where maybe the mother has died and the birds have hatched, or maybe the eggs were taken and then incubated on their own, they will imprint with the animal, whoever is closest, when they hatch. And so in this case, you can see that these ducklings imprinted on this dog and now follow the dog into the water just like they would the mother duck. And we see this as well in humans, where again, this Conrad Lorenz showed that baby geese who spent the first few hours of life with him would now follow him as around, thinking he was the mother goose in this case. And so the imprint stimulus of a nearby object is what causes the geese to follow that object. And so you could even use a robot or an animatronic object and allow for these geese to do this. And we see this quite happen a lot with birds, in that the birds will imprint on whoever they first see after they hatch out of the egg. And so you see that quite a bit with those situations. And so that they'll imprint and then follow that other animal around for the rest of their lives, because they think that's who mom is in those situations. And so you see that a lot. And I'm sure this also happens in mammals as well, but the few examples they gave was in birds in these situations. Now, another place that we see imprinting is within conservation biologists that have taken advantage, helping animals that were near extinction by using them and training them how to migrate. And so young whooping cranes can imprint on humans in the crane suits, and then the lead crane migrators using ultrafly aircraft to migrate to different parts of the country during the time of migration. And so again, first imprinting on the human in a crane suit, and we see this a lot of times in animals at zoos. And so where they will put them either with other animals that are very like this, or if there isn't an adult, they'll use gloves or stuffed animals to look like that animal, to kind of imprint on that animal. And so we see this a lot as well when we have these very young learning behavior type of things, and imprinting to show them the right behaviors and how to respond to certain behaviors as soon as they're born in these situations. Okay, now another type of learning is the spatial learning, and spatial learning is the establishment of memory that reflects spatial structure in an environment. And again, Nico Tinbergen showed that digger wasps use landmarks to find nests. And so what he did as an experiment is that he put pine cones around a nest. And so he put those pine cones around, and that the digger wasp would find where to go. Then he would move the pine cones over to a spot where the nest wasn't, and he found that the digger wasps would go to where the pine cones were, not where the nest was. And so they're using the environmental cues around there to show where the nest was actually, or where they thought the nest was actually shown. And so again, this is a behavior learning spatial behavior to say that, my nest is here when it really wasn't, and it was using the landmarks around it. And we kind of use this too a lot when we're trying to find places where we go. And so maybe going to school or going to different places, we'll use landmarks around us to say, oh yeah, I got to make that turn at the big green building, or I got to make that turn at that gas station, and then I make that left or another right, using different visual cues to tell us where we need to go and how we go. Or sometimes when we get lost and we just kind of know, I think I'm not in the right spot. Something gives me a feeling that I'm not in the right spot, and that's sometimes the spatial learning that we've used to figure out where we need to go and how to get to certain places. Now, another thing that can happen is the cognitive map, which is an internal representation of spatial relationships. And so, an example of this is the Clark nutcracker that uses food hidden in caches located halfway between a particular landmark. And so, what they'll do is they'll take seeds or juniper berries out of these plants, and then they'll hide them in different parts on their way to their nest. And again, they remember where all these hidden locations are based on the spatial cues that they have. So they build these very large maps of their surrounding environment and then hide food all over to, and again, they remember where all these food locations are based on the spatial maps they create. So it's really kind of cool. Another way of a learn type of behavior where they can learn to see where things are based on locations that they've seen over and over again around their nest. And so that's kind of interesting. Another thing that, again, we even display in humans is associative learning. And so animals associate one feature of their environment with another. And so the example is blue jay will avoid eating butterflies with specific colors after a bad experience with a distasteful monarch. And so they eat the monarch butterfly and then they go, oh, that wasn't very good. And they actually throw it back up. And so we've learned this as well. And so there are particular foods or smells that we may associate with bad things. And so maybe one time you ate something and you got really sick the next time and you're like, I'm never eating that again because, man, that made me really sick. And it may have been food poison, it may have been something else, but you always learn, oh, I had a bad experience at once, I'm never touching it again. And so we do this as well. And this is known as associative learning, that we learn something by association of something. And so this happens a lot of times, and it may be reasons why we don't like certain foods or certain smells or certain things that we do because we associate it with a bad experience. Some people, that's what happens in school. They have a bad experience with the teacher, and so they don't do well in school because they had that one bad experience sometime in life, and then they associate that a bad experience with the whole general response. And it's hard to break that cycle once that does happen. And so that's called associative learning. It's very, very interesting aspect that even happens in humans as well. Now, again, we've talked about associative learning, that they link many pairs of features in their environment, but not all. And so one example is that pigeons can learn to associate danger with sound, but not with color. So again, they can hear something and say that's bad, but if they see some color and know that and see and then not hear any sound and it's a bad thing, they won't be able to tell the difference. And so again, they can't do that. And in rats, they can avoid illness-inducing foods based on the smell of it, but not based on the sights or sounds. And so they associate everything with smell. They associate everything with hearing. And so again, it depends on the type of animal and what senses are best. And so again, like I said in previous lectures, I think that for us, smells are a big part of our emotional response, as well as taste, as well as some of the other memories that we have. And so again, sounds also play a role. And so for humans, I'm not sure if there's one in particular, but definitely in different animals, we do know that there's certain things that can be associative and certain things that may not be associative to these animals. Now, cognition is the process of knowing and may include the awareness and reasoning, recollection, and judgment. And this is going to be another thing that we look at with the beta fish. And so beta fish will respond even if it's a mirror. And so we'll do this in the class with the behavior. And so they can't recognize the difference between their own self and something else, where certain birds can, so that they can distinguish the same versus different. And so in this situation, you can see that this bird is the same. They're looking at the reflection. You can see that it has the same thing, but this bird is not, because again, it has the little red dot, and this is a different bird in this case, and they're showing a movie in this, and so I read that, and so that's why they can recognize the difference between the birds, but sometimes they can't, and so they can recognize self versus non-self, and so that's one of the things that you can look at, and look at different types of behaviors that are out there. So again, different cognition and being able to recognize the difference between looking at a reflection and those that. And again, there's certain animals that don't, because again, I can give many experiences with my cats at home, is that sometimes when they see themselves in the mirror, they start pawing at it and they don't recognize, they think it's another cat in the room, but they don't recognize themselves. And so that's cognition, that being able to see either themselves and recognizing versus non-self in that. And so again, that's one of the reasons how a lot of times we can recognize whether animals are cognitive or not of what's going on. And so that's one of the things we look at. Now, another example is problem solving. So, and we see this in a wide variety of animals. We've seen this in octopi and squids, that they can figure out problems. But the other example we see is that using the strategy to overcome an obstacle. So in this case, there's bananas hanging, and so what the chimpanzee recognizes are these boxes. He figures out how to stack the boxes and then be able to get the food. And so again, that's a big part of cognitive learning in those situations, and problem solving, and figuring out strategies to overcome an obstacle. And again, this is not something that's just in humans and in primates, but we see this in a lot of different animals, how to figure out a process of getting food, or figuring out how to work their way out. And like I said, we see this with octopi and squid, that they can even do this, and even in insects, a lot of times we see that they can figure out and problem solve around certain situations to get food or other things, or get to a mate in these situations. Now, we also see social learning, especially in colonial animals where they live together. And so where one animal will show how to do something to younger animals. In this case, this is a chimpanzee breaking open a nut using a rock. And so again, and then these chimps are learning and watching how this actually happens. And so this is using stones to break palm nuts. And again, this is going to be copied by other chimpanzees by learning what they do. So they see that they break the nut open, and then they get the food. So the other chimp learns how to do that and does that themselves, and he'll show that to the rest of the colony based on the different skills that they've learned over time. And so that would be social learning. Now, again, culture, again, when you have a large number of offspring and a large number of individuals that are closely associated with one another, will transfer information by observation and teaching that influences behaviors in a population. And this can alter behavior and influence the fitness of individuals. So again, using certain tools and other things to problem solve, to get food, or to mate, or other things. And so in this picture, the chimpanzee is learning to use a stick to open this box to get at the food. And so, and then showing the other chimps how to do that. And so learning how to survive in these environments. And so again, we see this a lot, especially in primates, to problem solve and then learn and show and display learning characteristics, and how to do these certain things and problem solve and get to the food or mating behaviors as well. And so that's another thing that we see. Okay, now for the rest of the time, we're going to be looking at how does this influence survival in that. And so again, selection of individual survival and reproductive success can explain diverse behaviors. So obviously looking for food is going to be an important part. How do you forage? How do you get food in order to survive as an individual? And so behavior enhances survival and reproductive success in a population. And so first we'll look at how do you get food, and then once you get food and become successful that way and avoid danger, how do you mate? And so that's kind of where we're going from here. So foraging is obtaining food behavior, and it includes searching for and recognizing, capturing, eating form items. And so again, some of this is based on evolution. And so the woodpecker has a specific type of beak that allows them to bore into wood and get to the insects on the inside of the plant. And so that would be a foraging behavior. Another type would be searching different areas, looking for food, recognizing and capturing, prey and looking for these different things. So you can think of the nocturnal animals that are out hunting at night and they hunt for their prey. That would be a foraging behavior. Or herbivores that eat on plants, looking for specific plants, again, using genetics. Maybe like a giraffe with a very tall neck can get at the top of the tree and again avoid competition with other herbivores that are out there and that are eating at the lower ends of the tree. So that's all different types of behavior that are included in foraging behavior. Okay, and then again, natural selection refines behaviors that enhance the efficiency in feeding. Like I said, the type of beak that certain birds have will allow it to forage, again, for different food. The types of animals, again, for behavior, predator-prey relationships, having specific speed and stealth and ability to capture prey is always a natural selection. Those that can find food and get food very easily are going to be more successful than those that don't have those abilities. And again, we see that where natural selection can play a big role on how well the animal is going to survive in these situations. Now, in this situation, there's a study done with Drosophila looking at foraging behavior. And so there's a forager gene that dictates foraging behavior of the larvae. And so those that are this foraging allele that have the R versus the S are going to be ones that travel farther. So if they have the R, they're going to travel farther away from the food than those that stay with the situation. So they call this the rovers versus the sitters. And so they look at it. And so what they say is that larvae in high density populations, so where they have lots of larvae around them, are going to forage farther. And that makes sense because they need to find more food around them to supply for all these different larvae. And so if you have lots of populations, you're going to see this. Now, in populations that have low density populations, they're going to be, again, not going as far because, one, they're going to be protecting one another as in the herd, and then they're also going to benefit from this short distance, so they don't have to go as far away. So it makes sense. And so when you have large populations, they're going to spread out because they need to get more food and avoid competition. Whereas when you have low density populations, you're not going to spread out as far because you're going to be more likely to protect each other and then just stay in the location because food is plentiful. And that makes a lot of sense. When you have less, you're going to have those things. And in the fruit flies, they actually have a gene. And again, the gene types are ones that are rovers versus sitters. And so you can see here the rovers will spread out where the sitters will stay in one spot. Now, in this population, we can mate them over and over again, and we see that the evolutionary changes of these two alleles were observed over several generations, and that the low populations stayed low, and the high populations showed the higher populations in these cases. So in this case, I'm sorry, I flipped this around. So when they're in low, so let's go back to this because I read this wrong and I looked at this before and I read this wrong all together. So when they have these genes, so let's go back to this. So in this case, again, the rovers will rover when there's high populations and the sitters will sit in these situations. So what they did was then they mated these same guys over and over again, but then they put them in different population densities. So when you had a low population density of rovers in these situations, they did not go as far as the sitters did when you put them in high population densities. And so again, when they were put in high populations, they started to rover. Where they didn't, they started to sit. And so again, the spatial situations also played a role. And so even though they had these different genes, and you can see here, the R1, R2, R3 were in low population densities, they did not rover because they were in a low density population, where the sitters here, these were the sitters, they actually rovered because they're in high population densities. So in this situation, that the evolution or the population density had a big effect on how these animals actually moved. And so you can see the changes in evolution that occurred over time due to the type of population density had, that the rovers lose the ability to rover because of the population density, and the sitters lost their ability to sit and now rover because of the high population density. And so that was the difference between those different things. So hopefully I did this right and it made sense. So these are the different generations, the 1, 2, 3. These are the rover generations, and these are the sitter generations. And then by changing the population density, you change their behavior based on where they were found in nature. And so again, that was one of the things that you see there. So I apologize for screwing that up at the beginning, but I think I got around it and finally explained it right in this situation. Now, the other thing that's a huge factor with, again, making sure populations grow instead of shrink is mating behavior. And so this includes seeking and attracting mates, choosing among potential mates, competing for mates, and caring for offspring. And mating relationships define the number of distinct mating systems. So we're going to talk about behaviors of courting, courtship, and then looking at types of mating patterns, so and then numbers. And so sometimes you have monogamous relationships, so many times you have polygamous relationships where you have multiple males or multiple females in one suit, and it's all about the numbers of offspring in these situations. So we'll take a look at all these different types of relationships that go on in these situations. So like I said before, mating relationships between male and females varies greatly between species to species. And so it's not just one thing from, when we talk about birds in general, not all birds are monogamous and not all mammals are monogamous in this case. And so there are a lot of different types of pair bonds. In some species, there's no strong pair bonds. But in examples of monogamous relationships, one male mates with one female for their whole life, and the mating systems seem to have similar morphologies. And so when you look at a male and a female, it's very difficult to tell the difference between a male and a female in these situations because they're in monogamous relationships. And so when you see birds where males look very similar to the females, you can kind of tell that that's going to be a monogamous relationship for the whole life because there's not a lot of difference between them. Okay? Now, in polygamous relationships, the individual one sex mates with several different individuals of sex. And so the species with polygamous mating systems are usually sexually dimorphic, meaning males and females have different external morphologies. And so we see this with lions and that. And so the male will have a mane showing I'm male and the females won't. And so that shows the difference. And again, this situation would be a polygamous situation where you have one male and lots of females. Again, a rooster looks very different in the colors of the feathers and the calls that they have than the female chickens in this case. And again, this would be a polygamous relationship. And then I show the example of, in this case, with a polygamous relationship with humans. And this can be sometimes religious based and other things. But again, typically males and females don't show many external, but there are some external differences in looking at the gender. So in males and females, obviously, I wouldn't say production of breast, but having the breast tissue in females, that would be one difference in morphology. And then I'm trying to think of the word here, the genders. So obviously the morphologies of the external genitalia are obviously different. And so some of the differences, also men tend to have more muscle than females and that. And so there's some other things and that gives some differences in the clues. So you can tell the difference between male and female, even in humans. And so that would kind of describe a polygamous relationship, but that doesn't mean that humans have to be in polygamous relationships based on just the external morphologies. I'm just showing you some of the biology and examples of those different types of things. Now, in polygamous relationships, they can be either polygynous or polyandrous. And so the difference is, again, in polygyny, it's one male mates with many females. And so males are usually more showy and larger than the females. So in a polygyny, you see a very large male with very large antlers with many multiple females in this case. And that's called polygynous. Okay, in polyandry, now the female is more showy in this case, and so the female will mate with multiple males. And so in these cases, and again, in other examples in birds, where the female is more showy and saying, hey, come mate with me type of thing with multiple males. And so again, showing those different types of things with the dimorphism. Now, and then like I said, we show different relationships based on those different types of things. Now, the other thing that plays a role with mating system is the needs of the young. And this is an important factor in constraining evolution of mating systems. And so, especially in mammals, we definitely see a lot of parental care in that. We also see this in birds as well, where there's a lot of parental care that goes on in these different types of things. So the nesting, and then also how long the offspring stay with the individual. So we definitely see this quite a bit in mammals as well. So again, consider the bird species where chicks need continuous supply of food. The male maximizes the reproductive success, staying with his mate, and caring for chicks, that would be monogamy. And so that would allow for a monogamous type of relationship where the male is going to allow for the offspring and benefit the offspring in those situations. So if the chicks are ones that are highly in need of continuous supply of food and stay around the nest much longer than other birds, and you're probably going to suspect a monogamous type of relationship. In a species where, again, the chicks are soon able to feed and care for themselves, you're going to have a relationship where you either have polygyny or polyandry, where males are going to mate with multiple females, or in the opposite situation, females are going to mate with multiple males. And so you see that situation. And again, a lot has to depend on the type of offspring that they have. So if the offspring has lots of parental needs, more likely going to be a monogamous relationship. Whereas if the offspring don't need a lot of parental care after being born, then it's probably going to be more of a polygamous type of relationship in these situations. Okay, and again, the certainty of paternity also influences parental care and mating behavior. So, female can be certain that an offspring she has given birth to or eggs she's laid contain her genes. And so, parental certainty depends on mating behavior. And so, in females, they know that that's their offspring, and so that's not a question. It's really the question of paternity a lot of times, and this even happens in humans. And so we have the situation where sometimes if females have multiple mates, paternity could come into question, and so this happens especially with internal fertilization, as I'll show you here. So one way that a paternal certainty can be gained in this case. So again, this just states that paternal certainty can be relatively low internal fertilization because the mate doesn't know where the sperm came from. So the mate may, especially if there are multiple mating relationships at one time, doesn't know which sperm actually fertilized the egg. But males can increase their certainty of paternity by mate guarding. So again, we see this in human relationships as well as in other animal relationships where the male will guard the female once he's inseminated the female, and then will stay around the female to not only to protect her and the offspring, but also to prevent any other reproduction going on at that time. So we see that happen. Another thing that animals will do is removal of sperm from the reproductive tract. So there are times where males will secrete a chemical to remove sperm from the other males that have previously copulated with that other female. And so we know examples of this. And so there are situations or where the sperm from the previous animal will be removed, and then they'll copulate and do that. And then the other situation is by producing large ejaculates to make sure that the sperm does and the number of sperm make it to the egg. So it's all about the numbers and making it to the egg. And so large ejaculates will reinforce that ability to make it and fertilize with that female. And so that's the other thing that you see in those situations. Now, the certainty of paternity is much higher when egg laying and mating occur together as an external fertilization. So because typically the male and the female both release sperm and egg at the same time. And so because of that, externally, they both will bind right away. And so the idea that the male and female will mate together or will have the same genes is more likely because the male and the female release the eggs and sperm at the same time. Internally, a lot of times the sperm has to get to the egg, and so there's time in between copulation and actually fertilization where that could be come into question. And so, like I said, we see that even in humans. With external, typically what happens is the eggs are released as the sperm is released, and then fertilization happens right at that same time. Now, in certain situations, there may be where egg and sperm are released into the water, and so there may be not a guarantee in those situations, but in most likely cases, when the sperm and egg are released at the same time, there is a guarantee that the paternity and maternity are guaranteed in those animals. And so also in those species, what you see is that parental care is at least as likely by males as in females. And so you can see here in this male fish, he's actually carrying the fertilized eggs in his mouth. And so this is a male actually doing this. And we see examples in seahorses as well, where seahorses will actually, the males will do the parental care and not the females. The females will release the eggs, the males will fertilize the eggs, and then they'll care for it in their pouches and care for the offspring until they're ready to be born. So that's a different situation as well, where males are actually the parental care as opposed to the females. And I'm not sure what fish this is, so I don't know, but you can see the fish, the male, this is a male fish that's actually holding the fertilized eggs in his mouth and protecting them and giving them parental care until those hatchlings are hatched and produce the new offspring in those cases. Okay, now other types of dimorphism that results is from natural selection. And so again, we see two different types of dimorphism. The first one is called intersexual selection, in which members of one sex choose mates based on certain traits. And so this will be a display type of characteristic. So the males or females, depending on the type of relationship, show that, hey, I've got these wonderful feathers. Look at me. I am great. Why don't you mate with me? So that would be one type of thing, and that would be intersexual selection, because the females basing it on the display that they see. Intrasexual selection involves competitions for members of the same sex for mates. So a lot of times we see this where males will have aggression towards other males and they will fight to say, I'm the dominant one, I am going to mate. And so we'll see that a lot of times, especially in mammals, but we also see this as well in other insects and other animals that show these different types of behaviors. Beta fish are another one where they get aggressive, and again, we're going to see that, and that would be an example of an intersexual selection where you have competition. And if we put those two fish together, they would fight, and one would win and one would die based on that competition. We won't do that in the lab, but we'll get them at least to display their aggressive behavior and go after the other fish. And so we'll use that and see how that actually happens. And that would be a form of intrasexual selection where the males fight for mating with the female. Okay, now the female choice is a type of intersexual competition where females can drive the sexual selection by choosing males and specific behaviors and features of the anatomy. For example, female stalk-eyed flies would choose males with very long stalks. And so these eye stalks here, this female will say, wow, you're very beautiful. I'm going to mate with you because you have these extremely long eye stalks. We see this a lot with birds. And so a lot of birds like robins and blue jays and cardinals the males all have very robust and very colorful feathers, and they show a very great display, where the females are kind of drab. And the females will use that color and say, wow, you're a wonderful looking male, I want to mate with you. And so that would be an example of intersexual selection, where the female decides who she's going to mate with based on the genes that this thing is showing. And so it's the ornaments or the color that show health and vitality, saying, I've got good genes, mate with me. And so that's what they're looking at. And the other one, we have intrasexual selection. Male competition is the source of intrasexual selection, so it reduces the variation among males. And so they're going to look very similar, but it's the competition and the survival of the competition who's going to decide who mates. So the female doesn't get to decide. It's the males, when they fight one another, decides who gets to mate based on who's the strongest, who's the best. And again, it shows a lot about the genes, because the strongest is going to survive. And so the ones that have the best behavior, the ones that are going to be the most aggressive, and again have the right survival skills against the other males, is going to be the one that survives and goes and mates on, where the other males are not going to be able to mate. And so that's the idea there. And so that is going to be the behavior where they're going to fight each other, the agnostic behavior where they're going to fight one another, and then the winner is going to be the one that mates. So that's the difference between inter versus intra. Inter selection is the female decides, in the intra selection, the males fight, and the winner decides who's going to mate in those situations there. Now, again, when we look at genetic analysis, the concept of exclusive fitness is essentially the good genes are going to survive. And so this is the whole idea of the good gene theory. And the good gene theory really states that those individuals that have the good genes and the best genes are going to be the ones that mate and survive longer and then pass on their genes to the next generation. And you can kind of see that here in this example, is those where you have mutations that create variations. The ones that are unfavorable mutations are not going to survive. They're not going to be able to pass their genes on. Where you have ones where you have favorable mutations are going to be the ones that are going to survive. And so those mutations are the ones that make it on. Those survive, and they survive on. An example of this could be social behaviors. So parental care could be a behavior that allows them to survive. mate choice between which mate is going to be the right one, non-social foraging, which food are you going to get, and are you going to get the right ones, and then predator avoidance, obviously a big one, being able to survive and get away from those things. So again, between the social and non-social behaviors and those things, along with the fitness. And so those that survive and can feed themselves and avoid predators, along with picking the right mates and parental care, are going to be reproductive success. Those that don't survive. And so that's where you see it. So good genes are going to survive versus the ones that bad mutations are not going to allow them to survive. And so they're not going to be able to reproduce. And so that's how natural selection actually works. Okay, so again, the difference between a single locus, so this is an example where genes will affect in the different organisms. So an example, a male prairie vole pair bonds with their mates, and while the male meadow voles do not. And and based on their genes that they have, so in this example, this is a behavioral pattern based on the expression of a receptor gene. So ones that have the antidiuretic hormone or ADH are going to pair bond, where the ones that don't use vasopressin. And so this is an example where a gene receptor plays a role in how they're going to pair bond with their individual. So in certain voles they will, in others they won't, based on the relationships, and that's all of a genetic relationship there based on what types of receptors they actually display. Now, environments can have a huge difference, and so behavioral variation between populations can correspond to environmental variation, and so may reflect natural selection. And so this is examples of animals living with humans, essentially. And so we see animals that have now broken from the main tribes and now live with human populations. We see this especially with coyotes, coyote populations that are found in residential populations, fox that are around. So I know in Waukesha, where I live, there's lots of fox around, and they are not afraid of humans anymore and that stuff, and they come in and do that. Birds living in cities, again, learn to adapt and survive in high places, build nests in buildings rather than in trees, and that whales and other animals working with boats and being able to avoid those different things and being able to survive just fine, and that. But we do see how behavioral variation can be affected by environmental cues as well, and they can affect these different things. So normal nest building may be different in a building than it would be in a tree, or animals living in the city, finding places to forage and hide and look for things, again, living in the city versus living in the forest. So that can be a difference as well. Now, one of the case studies in variation could be in prey selection. And so the example is in garter snakes, in that certain coastal garter snakes will feed on banana slugs, while inland garter snakes will rarely eat banana slugs. So again, it's all dependent on where they live. And so even though they're the same species, one set of species that live close to the coast will feed on these banana slugs, while the other ones will not eat them based on where they live. And so this is an environmental cue. And again, it is shown that the differences in the diet are genetic. And so what genetic plays a role in how this actually happens. And how this actually works is that they differ in their ability to detect and respond to specific odors produced by banana slugs. So the coastal ones can detect the banana slugs, while the non-coastal ones cannot. And so it's based on that has led to this behavioral variation, is that these garter snakes can find these guys. The coastal ones can find the banana slugs and eat them very readily, while the ones that live more inland cannot. They don't have that ability to sense them, so they can't find them, so they won't eat them. And so that is where, even though they're the same species, just living in their environments have an effect on their genetics. And again, natural selection over time has caused these changes. And so even though they're the same species, they're different based on the genetic variation of and that's influenced by the environment in these cases. So one can sense it, the other one can't. Okay, and so that's kind of an interesting study, just looking at the same species, and that kind of goes along with the twin studies that we talked about, or the co-fostering studies that we've seen in the past as well. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about is altruism. And so this is a behavior that maximizes the individual's survival for reproduction. And so again, natural selection is going to make sure that if I have the best genes, I'm going to be able to procreate and pass on my genes. These behaviors are typically selfish, but we also see individuals where there's kind behavior known as altruism that helps out the rest of the population. And so this is where certain animals that can't breed may help the rest of the population by giving themselves up for food to protect the rest of the herd, or something like this, or the weak one of the herd gives themselves up in an altruistic thing to allow for the rest of the offspring to survive in this case. And this is called altruism or selflessness. And so an example would be a hungry bat that isn't able to get food is given food by one that has plenty of food, and this is a vampire bat, so they pass blood to one another, where the blood is passed from one that's eaten very well to one that is very hungry, and that would be an example of altruism. Natural selection would say this guy would die because he can't find the food, and this guy would survive because he gets all the food, and so that would be an example. But in this case, the altruism wins out, where this guy says, you know what, I've got plenty of food, I'm going to pass it on to my buddy who's starving here, and that will benefit us both. Okay, or like in this situation where you have cross species, where this mouse is actually sitting on the back of the frog and they're not attacking each other, but he's providing the mouse a way to get out of the water, and so he doesn't have to swim to shore, and the frog will eventually get him to shore. And so that would be an example of altruism or selflessness in these cases. Now, an example of this in offspring would be where you have the under a threat of a predator. The individual belting ground squirrel will make an alarm to warn the others. Even though the calling increases the likelihood that the caller is going to be killed because the prey is going to go there. So one sacrifices themselves for the rest of the pack and sends out a warning signal. And so we see this a lot of times in movies, in that one hero, the altruistic hero, will sacrifice himself to save the rest of the group in that situation. Another one that we see, an example, would be the naked mole rat populations for non-reproductive individuals may sacrifice themselves to protect those that can produce lots of offspring. And so in this situation, that they protect the reproductive king and queen and kings from predators. So they'll sacrifice themselves to make sure that the population lives on. And that would be an example of altruism. Now, we also see this as a possibility called inclusive fitness, that altruism can be explained, and that this would be where individuals of families will protect the other individuals so that they can reproduce. And so exclusive fitness is the total effect an individual has on proliferating its genes by producing offsprings and helping close relatives produce offsprings. And so this would be the idea. So this guy here has his offspring of his own, and that would be direct fitness, but he would also influence his recipient. So maybe he has a sister or a cousin out there that he provides some benefit for, maybe provides food for or shelter, and that would affect her offspring as well. So maybe the sister lost her job in her house and doesn't have a husband, and so he says, you know what, instead of having these poor offspring starve, what I'm going to do is be altruistic, and they can live in my house, and I'll provide them food and money and shelter, and then all of our family can survive together. And that would be an example of inclusive fitness. And so that's the idea, providing a benefit to a recipient that will then help all the individual members survive. And so that would be the indirect fitness in this situation. So this was a theory that was designed, or hypothesis that was proposed by William Hamilton, that decided to come up with a quantitative measure for predicting natural selection versus altruistic acts in the individuals. And the variables that were in this altruistic act had to be the benefit to the recipient, the cost of the altruist, so what happens to the altruist if that altruist dies, and then the coefficient of relatedness to the genes that are shared, and that's the R. And so Hamilton's rule basically states the propensity of an individual to go out for his or her way to benefit a related individual, and that's William Hamilton's rule. And this is a picture of William Hamilton. He has since died, but again, he was a very major player in the role of animal behavior and looking at altruism and how that affects the behavior of the others and survival of the other groups in these cases. And so in his rule on kin selection, he said that natural selection favors altruism when the benefits outweigh the risk to the altruist. And so that's the idea here. And so the inequality is called Hamilton's rule. And the rule is illustrated for an example of a girl who risked his life to save her brother. And so in this situation, these individuals are saving the larvae of the individual that gave birth to him. And so this would be an altruistic act because they may not be their larvae, but they're all related in certain ways. And so that's the idea of that picture there, showing the altruistic fact. So let's take a look at the Hamilton's rule in kin selection. So assume the average individual has 2 children. as a result of the sister's action, the brother now can father 2 children of himself. So this is just using the variable saying that every person has 2 children, every couple has 2 children out there. That would be the rule of thumb. And so the brother of that family, so let's say they have 2 children, they have a brother and a sister. In that, there are 2 children, 1 boy, 1 girl, brother and sister. And now that brother can father 2 children, so the B would be 2 in this situation. Now the sister has a 25% chance of dying and not being able to have 2 children of her own, so C would be 0.25 times 2, or 0.5. The brother and sister share half their genes on the average, so R would be 0.5. So if you multiply the 0.5 times 2, that is equal to 1, versus the risk of trying to save her life, which would be 0.25 times 2, because that would be the loss of her children, or 0.5. So in this situation, altruism would be better than the natural selection, because if she saves the lives of her brother, that brother can have 2 children, and the risk would be less than the survival of having more children. So even though she may die in that situation, having her brother survive would be a better benefit than her just dying in that ability to save his life. Now, if they both die, obviously that would play a big role in that. But what this is saying is doing an altruistic act is actually more beneficial than just the sister saying, well, if I survive, at least then I can have kids, and too bad for my brother in that situation. The risk is better that maybe she dies, maybe she doesn't. If she saves the brother's life and she survives, now they would have 4 offspring as opposed to 2. And so that's the idea there. If she dies, well, then the sister dies, and that you'd lose those 2 offspring, but you'd still have 2 offspring because the brother would have 2 in that case. And so this is kind of working that out in that hypothetical situation. Okay, so the idea is, so let me try and explain this better if you look at that. So you have the family, you have a boy and girl in that family, and then the brother and sister. Let's say the brother gets into a car accident, and the daughter or the sister has to save the life somehow. So whether her donating blood or donating an organ or something like that. In that situation, or maybe let's say the car accident was the brother getting hit by a car. Okay, and so the brother was walking on the sidewalk, and the car came up, and she was walking with the brother. Okay, so that would be the situation. Let's talk about it that way, so it makes it a little bit easier. So if nothing happened to both the brother and sister, and we assume that both of them had 2 kids, the total would be 4 kids. Okay, so that would be the idea. So that would be your total population in that situation. Now, if they got in that situation where the brother and sister were in this thing, and the brother got hit and killed by a car, now the offspring would be 2. Okay, because the sister could go on and still have 2 kids of her own in that case, and the number would be 2. Okay, now if the sister risked her life and to save the brother, the number would be 2 in that case. So if she pushed the brother out of the way and she still died, that number would be 2. But if for some reason pushed him out of the way and she got out of the way too, she would survive too, and that number would be 4. So what they're saying is the risk is better than the reward there. So even if she just survived, there would be 2. That the risk of both of them dying is less than the risk of either having just 2 of their own or a total of 4 on their own. I probably still didn't explain it very well, but the idea is that the risk is good enough to survive, for both of them to survive, because you'd still have the idea of still having 4 as opposed to only just having 2, because you'd be guaranteed 2 if the sister did nothing, because the sister would survive and the brother would die. Okay, but if the sister risked her life and pushed the brother out of the way, he would still have 2, but there was still a benefit that they both survive and they would have 4. And so that's the idea in that you'd still have a better chance, even risking her life, to have 4 rather than 2 if she did nothing at all. Hopefully that makes sense, and that's Hamilton's rule, and that's displayed by the numbers here. So if you look at it, that the ability, and again this is just shown in the numbers, that the genes along with how many potential the brother could have is a higher number than just the sister dying herself and losing the offspring that she would have here. And so that's the idea in that case, that the benefit for the brother is better than the risk that the sister would take in dying herself. Okay, so that's the idea there. Now, kin selection is the natural selection that favors altruistic behavior by enhancing reproductive success of the close relatives. And so what that means is that the more that you help other relatives, the more likely the genes from that family are going to be passed on. So what it's showing and what it's describing is that due to the gene relationships that we have with one another, that's going to allow for the ability. So if you have siblings that have kids, even if you don't have them and you risk your life to save them, you're passing on your genes on to the next generation, even though it's only half those genes. But that's the idea, that even though that you may not have kids, but you risk your life to save your niece and nephew in that way, would be better than doing nothing at all, because then by risking your life to save them, you're providing a benefit to them and passing, even though you only share half your genes, you're more likely to pass those on to the next generation. And so that's the idea for altruism, is that individuals that couldn't reproduce should sacrifice themselves in an altruistic manner to protect the rest of the offspring. So because their genes are still going to be passed on, even though it's not full all of their genes in that case, at least some of their genes are getting passed on to the next generations in those situations. And so that would be kin selection in that. So kin selection saying that depending on how close you are or closely related, shows you how many genes of yours are being passed on to other offspring, even though they're not your offspring in this case. And this shows you the direct relationships of the different genes in these cases. So this represents the percentages of genes. So if you have a mother and a father in this case, they have kids in this situation, another mother and father, they share half their genes between the brother and sister. They pass on half their genes to their offspring, which is 25% of the grandparents. And so they have that. And then again, mating with another child here or another offspring here, that would be 0.5. And you can see that the offspring that don't have children still have a 0.5 with the niece or nephew that are unrelated, or that are related but by a niece and nephew. So that's kind of showing you that that even though these may not have any offspring, the benefit is that even half of their genes are being passed on to the niece or nephew in this case. And that's kind of showing the relationship, and that in this situation, cousins in this situation have about an eighth of the genes, or 0.125 in this situation. You can kind of see the relationships here of the genes based on the parent and the child, and looking at all those different things. So this just kind of explains the numbers that are used in the Hamilton's rule. So again, it gets into math and that stuff, and I know a lot of you guys are like, I'm not a big fan of math, but you can kind of calculate the statistics in that, and showing you Hamilton's rule here, that even an offspring that doesn't have, or having a related family member that doesn't have any offspring, still passes on genes to the individual, because it comes from the brother or sister from that family as well. Okay, so that is it for looking at the kin selection. So we made it through. Hopefully I kept you along and that stuff and didn't lose you in the Hamilton selection or any of those other things. But you can see that a lot of behaviors are influenced by environmental, they're influenced by learning, and some of them we're just born with. And so those are some of the ideas that we looked at today. So the first thing we looked at was discrete sensory inputs can stimulate both simple and complex behaviors. And some of the animal responses are to stimuli are basically behaviors. And so the stimuli causes us to respond, and those responses come out as behaviors. And that's the motor influence, whether it means running away from something, going towards something, making a sound, running around. Those are all different types of behaviors. Signals, communication, and pheromones result in behaviors as well, and that's intercommunication between the individuals of that species. And so again, they communicate with one another, whether it be warning signals, whether, hey, there's food here, or maybe for mating behaviors as well. And so those are all different types of stimulations that lead to different types of behaviors. Learning plays a big role in specific links between experience and behavior. We showed that learning from different individuals will allow individuals to do different things. We talked about problem solving, in that individuals can share their knowledge with other individuals of the species, and communities that are, again, close-knit communities can share that behavioral information with one another as well. And so we looked at all those different types of things, and that how experience can lead to learning and behavior in those situations. Again, then we talked about selection of individual survival. So for individual survival and reproductive success, so first was the foraging, so being able to be survival. I would say foraging and avoiding predators, that's going to be for individual survival. And then displays look at reproductive success. So we talked about different types of relationships that are out there, either monogamous or polygamous. Monogamous, typically the males and females look very similar to one another, so there's not a lot of differences. Whereas in polygamous type of relationships, you have different looks to males and females, and you have different types. You have polygyny, which is essentially where males mate with many different females, and then you have polyandry, which is where females mate with many different males in that situation. And so that's the key. And again, that shows you what types of displays you see. So in polygyny, you're going to see bright, beautiful males that are saying, hey, mate with me, and that, whereas with polyandry, you're going to see more of that in females. We also talked about offspring and how that would play a role in between monogamous and polygamous relationships. If offspring need lots of care, then you're primarily going to have monogamous relationships, whereas polygamous relationships, if offspring don't need a lot of parental care, and that you may see where males leave and go very quickly and the females are in charge in that. And then we saw, again, the other type of thing that we looked at was intersexual versus sexual. And I think that's down in the genetic analysis when we looked at that. And so we talked about genetic analysis, and I'll talk about that here. Genetic analysis and the concept of inclusive fitness provide basis for studying evolution of behavior. So one, natural selection, obviously the good genes are going to win out. And we saw the difference between intersexual relationships. So intersexual, the female decides based on the displays that the male has. And so typically the better, the more healthy and pretty you are, the more likely you're going to mate in those situations. And so again, showing good genes and displays versus intrasexual relationships where males will fight one another. Again, in the survival, the strongest male is going to be the one that mates in that situation. And so the female doesn't decide, the males themselves decide among the group. And then the winner of those relationships or behaviors is going to be the one that mates with the females in those cases. And then finally, the last thing we talked about was altruism, and that altruism is using offspring or certain individuals to provide a act that will allow for the rest of the population to survive. So maybe self-sacrifice or some other individual aspect of altruism so that the next generations can pass the genes on. And we showed Hamilton's rule, which was showing the relationships between siblings or individuals and their genetics and the sharing of genes, and that even though you may have an individual that doesn't reproduce, those genes still get passed on in siblings. And so half those genes get passed on. And so even though you may not see that nieces and nephews of other offsprings do share genes with one another. And so in that situation, so if you have nieces and nephews, they share half your genes with your siblings. And so that's kind of an interesting aspect in that if you never have kids and you keep them alive, so if you self-sacrifice yourself in those situations for the survival of those offspring, it would be like having your own offspring and saving them as well. So that's kind of the idea of the altruistic effect in that case and looking at Hamilton's rule. Okay, so we made it to the end of this lecture. Hopefully you got something out of it. We'll have some fun in the lab looking at animal behavior and how the fish interact with one another, and we'll look at the innate behaviors of the insects. So we'll look at two different types of animals, an invertebrate and a vertebrate animal, and see how they behave. And like I said, if you have time, look at your dog or cat if you have one at home or another animal and see how they behave and see different cues that trigger these different types of behaviors and that stuff, and just take time watching those things. And that's what a behavioral ecologist does, is just sit and watch the animals and how they behave for long periods of time. So with that, if you have any questions, please ask. Otherwise, I'll see you in class. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.